The morning sun climbed slowly over the green hills of rural Tennessee, casting long shadows across the 50 acres that Robert Jackson now called home. At 45, his face told stories that his lips rarely shared. The deep lines around his eyes weren't just from squinting in the bright southern sunshine, they were etched there from years of seeing things most folks couldn't imagine. Robert wiped sweat from his brow as he finished repairing the fence line. His strong hands moved with purpose, the same hands that had once assembled weapons in complete darkness and carried wounded teammates through gunfire. These days, they mostly dug in soil and fixed farm equipment, and he preferred it that way. 5 years had passed since he hung up his uniform after 20 years in Delta Force, the military's most secretive and elite fighting unit. Most people in town just knew him as that quiet black fella with the vegetable farm down by the creek. They'd wave when they passed his beaten-up pickup truck, and he'd nod back with a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. Nobody needed to know about the 3 Purple Hearts or the Silver Star Medal tucked away in an old ammo box under his bed. Robert didn't talk about the night raid in Afghanistan that left him with a slight limp, or how he could still name every man he'd lost under his command. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed. "Mornin' thunder," Robert said, patting the neck of his chestnut horse. The animal nudged against his shoulder, almost knocking him off balance. "Easy there, big fella. Breakfast is coming." The farm had saved him in ways the army psychiatrists never could. There was healing in the simple rhythm of country life, the predictable changing of seasons, the straightforward problems that needed fixing, the animals that depended on him. Here, a man's worth wasn't measured by how many targets he could eliminate or how silently he could move through enemy territory. After feeding the horses, Robert walked through rows of tomatoes, beans, and corn he planted weeks earlier. The spring planting had gone well, and if the weather held, he'd have a good harvest. Some crops he sold at the weekend market in town, others he donated to the local food pantry. The rest he kept for himself, enjoying the satisfaction of eating what his own hands had grown. His nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down the dirt road, just how Robert liked it. The solitude gave him space to breathe when the memories closed in, usually in the dead of night when the farmhouse creaked and settled. On the worst nights, he'd sit on the porch until dawn, his old service dog Chief resting his gray muzzle on Robert's knee, both of them keeping watch more out of habit than necessity. Inside the modest farmhouse, everything had its place. Military precision never quite leaves a man. The coffee pot was set for 5 a.m. His boots stood aligned by the door. The windows were positioned to give clear sightlines in all directions, not that he expected trouble, but 20 years of training doesn't disappear overnight. As the day wore on, Robert chopped firewood, checked on his beehives, and repaired an irrigation line. Physical work kept his mind occupied and his body tired enough to sometimes sleep through the night. The farm demanded constant attention, but that was part of why he chose this life. Idle hands left too much room for dark thoughts. By evening, as purple shadows stretched across his fields, Robert sat on his porch steps with a plate of food, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance. Chief dozed nearby, occasionally twitching in his sleep. Tomorrow would bring more of the same honest work, and that was just fine. What Robert didn't know as he headed to bed that night was that his peaceful existence had already caught unwanted attention. The black pickup truck that had slowly driven past his property twice that week wasn't lost. The men inside weren't admiring his well-kept farm. They were watching, planning, completely unaware that the quiet black farmer they were targeting had once been among the most dangerous men alive. But for tonight, Robert slept the uneasy sleep of a man who had seen too much, while crickets sang outside his window and a half-moon cast silver light across his fields. The war felt far away, for now. The first signs of trouble came with the changing leaves of fall. Robert was loading freshly harvested pumpkins into his truck when he noticed the black pickup crawling past his property for the 3rd time that week. He paused, pumpkin in midair, watching as the vehicle slowed near his mailbox. The driver never waved, just stayed with cold eyes before speeding away in a cloud of dust. Something in Robert's gut tightened, the same feeling he'd had in war zones when things got too quiet. Some instincts never fade. That evening at the general store, Robert overheard whispers that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Wilson, who ran the post office, was telling the clerk about the Chen family's farm 10 miles east. Burned their shed to the ground, she said, leaning over the counter. Spray-painted awful words all over their house too. Fourth farm hit this month, and every single one owned by people of color. Sheriff's Department claims they're looking into it, but you know how that goes. Robert paid for his supplies and left without joining the conversation. On the drive home, he passed the Chen's property. The charred remains of their storage shed stood like a blackened skeleton against the golden sunset. The family was outside, the father hammering plywood over a broken window while his children watched with sullen faces. Robert slowed his truck but didn't stop. Getting involved meant questions about his past, and that was something he avoided at all costs. Still, seeing that family reminded him of villages he protected overseas. Some fights find you whether you want them or not. Back at his farm, Robert walked the perimeter before dark, an old habit renewed with purpose. Near the edge of his property where the forest thickened, he found footprints that weren't his own and a cigarette butt still smelling of smoke. Someone had been watching his place. That night, he pulled out a metal footlocker from under his bed. The combination lock clicked open to reveal pieces of his former life. Tactical gear, communication devices, and tools that had kept him alive in places whose names couldn't be mentioned. Robert hadn't touched these things in 5 years, had promised himself he never would again. Yet here he was, checking batteries and frequencies with hands that remembered every switch and button. The next morning, Robert drove to the library in the next town over. Nobody knew him there. He used their computer to search news articles about the farm attacks. The pattern became clear. Always at night, always the same group of men according to witnesses, always targeting minority farmers who lived alone or in isolated areas. The sheriff's bland statements about ongoing investigations appeared after each incident with no arrests made. When he returned home, a business card was tucked in his screen door. Deputy Williams, it read, with a handwritten note on the back, stopped by to discuss recent incidents in the area. Please call. Robert ignored it. In his experience, law enforcement either showed up too late or asked questions he couldn't answer. Better to handle things himself. Over the next week, Robert set up an early warning system around his property, fishing line strung with empty cans in the woods, motion-activated game cameras hidden in trees, and solar-powered floodlights that could turn night into day with the flip of a switch. He reinforced doors, checked the sight on his hunting rifle, and mapped out every approach to his house. At the farmer's market that weekend, he noticed the stares. Word had spread about the attacks, and people looked at him differently now, some with pity, others with something darker in their eyes. The old-timers who usually bought his honey barely acknowledged him. A woman pulled her child closer when he walked by. On his way home, the black pickup appeared again, this time behind him on the road. It followed for 3 miles before turning off. Robert memorized the license plate without even trying, B7K429. Some things become second nature when you've spent years tracking threats. That evening, as he sat on his porch cleaning garden tools, Robert spotted a camera flash from the tree line. Someone was photographing his property. Instead of hiding, he stood up, facing directly toward the flash. Let them see him. Let them know he wasn't afraid. What they couldn't see was that the quiet farmer they were watching had once commanded elite teams in the world's deadliest places. They couldn't know that while they were planning their next attack, he was preparing a welcome they'd never forget. Robert rose before dawn, a habit 20 years in special forces had burned into his bones. The farm lay quiet under a blanket of early morning fog as he moved silently through the tree line, checking the tripwires and cameras he'd set up. A light rain had fallen overnight, turning the ground soft. That's when he spotted them, fresh boot prints, at least 3 different sizes, circling the eastern edge of his property. Someone had been here while he slept. Not just passing by, but studying his farm, looking for ways in. The largest print had a distinctive zigzag pattern he recognized from popular hunting boots. The smallest belonged to someone who dragged their left foot slightly. Details matter when your life might depend on them. Back at the house, Robert brewed coffee and spread a hand-drawn map of his property across the kitchen table. He marked where he'd found the footprints, creating a pattern that told a story. These weren't random trespassers. They'd checked his fence line, the distance from the road to his house, the location of his generator, and the blind spots behind his barn. This wasn't their first visit, and it wouldn't be their last. While walking his back 40 that afternoon, Robert found something that made his heart beat faster. A small trail camera strapped to an oak tree pointed directly at his back door. He studied it without touching it, noting the brand and direction. Whoever placed it wanted to learn his daily routine when he left, when he returned. Instead of removing it, Robert walked past it several times that day, establishing a false pattern. He carried empty feed bags to make it look like he was tending animals in the barn at the same time each afternoon. Let them think they knew his schedule. Two can play this game, he muttered, returning to his storage shed. From a locked cabinet, he retrieved his own surveillance equipment, military-grade cameras no bigger than a matchbox. By nightfall, he had a complete view of every approach to his house, the footage streaming to a tablet he kept nearby. That night, headlights swept slowly past his driveway around midnight. Through his night vision binoculars, Robert made out 3 men in the black pickup. One held something that looked like a map. They were planning. The next morning, Robert drove 2 counties over where nobody knew him. At a hardware store, he bought extra locks, motion sensors, and materials to reinforce his doors and windows. The teenage cashier looked at his purchases with curiosity. "Building a fortress?" she joked. "Just some home improvements," Robert answered with a quiet smile. On his way home, he took a detour past the Chent family's farm again. The father was outside, hammering a new door onto their rebuilt shed. Robert slowed his truck, then made a decision. He pulled into their driveway. "Need a hand?" he asked, stepping out. Mr. Chen looked surprised but nodded. For the next hour, they worked together in silence. As Robert was leaving, Mr. Chen spoke up. "They came at night. 3 trucks, 7 men. They wore masks, but I recognized one voice. Works at the feed store in town." He paused. "They said we were next on their list. Your farm, I mean. They mentioned the black farmer on Creek Road. Thought you should know." Robert thanked him with a nod and drove home with a heaviness in his chest. The enemy now had a face, a voice, a location. In his former life, this was the point where he would plan a counterstrike, but civilian life had different rules. Or did it? Back home, Robert checked his surveillance feed and noticed someone had moved his trail camera to a new tree, one with a better view of his bedroom window. Fine by him, let them waste time watching him pretend to sleep while he prepared. In the barn, he began setting traps, not to kill or maim, but to confuse and contain. He rigged doors that would lock from the outside when triggered. He created tripwires that would activate the farm's irrigation sprinklers, turning the yard into a muddy mess. Near his chicken coop, he installed fishing line at ankle height that would send empty paint cans crashing down, harmless but disorienting in the dark. As the sun set, Robert stood on his porch, looking out over the land he'd worked so hard to make his peaceful home. 5 years he'd been here, trying to forget the violence of his past life. Now that past might be the only thing that would save him. His phone rang. Deputy Williams again. Robert let it go to voicemail. Whatever was coming, he would handle it himself. Some storms you can't outrun. Some you have to face head-on. Friday arrived with dark clouds hanging low over the hills, perfect cover for what Robert knew was coming. The air felt heavy with approaching rain and something else, the electric tension that comes before conflict. Years in combat zones had taught him to sense danger, like animals that grow restless before an earthquake. As the sun set, Robert went through his final preparations. He powered down his house, making it look like he'd gone to bed early. Then he moved to his observation post in the hayloft of the barn, where he had clear sightlines to every approach. His old military pack sat beside him, not filled with weapons, but with tools he might need: zip ties, a first aid kit, night vision goggles, and a police-grade scanner that picked up local radio traffic. Chief, his aging service dog, lay quietly beside him. The old German shepherd's ears perked up occasionally, sensing his owner's focused energy. Robert stroked the dog's head gently. "One more mission, old friend," he whispered. "Then maybe they'll leave us be." Around 11:30 p.m., the scanner crackled with the voice of Deputy Williams, reporting that he was starting his patrol on the other side of the county. No help would come from that direction tonight, not that Robert had expected any. Just after midnight, with the rain now falling steadily, Robert's tablet lit up with movement at the edge of his property. Through the night vision feed, he watched 3 pickup trucks kill their headlights and roll slowly down the access road that ran along his eastern fence line. They stopped just out of sight of the house, and 7 men climbed out. Even in the green glow of night vision, Robert could see they were armed, shotguns, rifles, and what looked like baseball bats. They huddled briefly, then split into 3 groups. 4 men headed toward the main house. 2 circled toward the back of the property. The last man, taller than the others and clearly in charge, stayed by the trucks. Robert recognized him from town, the owner of the feed store who always seemed to have a problem making eye contact with him. Funny how some men could hate a person just for the color of their skin without knowing anything else about them. The raid began with a sharp crack as one of the men cut the power line to the house, plunging the property into darkness. What they didn't know was that Robert had expected this move. His security systems ran on a separate circuit powered by a generator buried behind the chicken coop. Robert watched calmly as the men converged on his house, their confidence growing with each step. They'd done this before to people who weren't prepared, people who were scared, people who weren't former Delta Force commanders with over 200 combat missions under their belt. The first sign that things weren't going as planned came when 2 men tried to force the back door. Robert had reinforced it with steel bars inside the frame. Their crowbar bent uselessly against it. Frustrated, they moved to a window, but the seemingly normal glass was actually hurricane grade, another modification Robert had made days earlier. Meanwhile, the 2 men who had circled to the rear of the property were getting closer to one of Robert's first traps. One man tripped the fishing line, sending empty paint cans crashing down around them. They fired wildly into the darkness, hitting nothing but giving away their positions. The leader by the trucks was getting nervous now, talking urgently into a walkie-talkie. Robert could hear the confusion in his voice. This was not how these raids usually went. Now was the time. Robert activated the first of his prepared responses. Floodlights hidden in the trees suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the entire yard with blinding white light. The men froze, momentarily blinded and exposed. Through his earpiece connected to microphones around the property, Robert could hear their panicked voices. "What the heck is going on? I can't see anything. Is he out there watching us?" The 2 men at the back of the property were now running toward the barn, exactly where Robert wanted them. As they yanked open the side door, they triggered his next trap. The automatic irrigation system burst to life, powerful jets of cold water hitting them square in the chest, knocking one man off his feet. Robert moved silently down from the hayloft. Years of training had made him practically invisible in the shadows. As the men stumbled about, soaking wet and confused, Robert watched and waited. The hunt had begun, but unlike his years in the military, tonight Robert wasn't looking to kill. He just wanted to send a very clear message. They had picked the wrong farm, and definitely the wrong farmer. The farm had become a battlefield, but unlike the scorching deserts and dense jungles where Robert had once fought, this was his home ground. Every tree, every dip in the land, every shadow was an advantage he had carefully planned for. 2 of the attackers stumbled toward the barn, cursing as they wiped water from their eyes. The irrigation sprinklers had soaked them to the bone in the cold night air. Robert moved silently behind them, a shadow among shadows. 20 years of training had taught him to control even his breathing, to step without sound, to become part of the darkness itself. "This ain't right, man," the shorter one whispered, his voice shaking. "This farmer's got some kind of setup. Maybe we should bail." "Shut up," his partner hissed back. "We ain't leaving till we teach him a lesson. Boss wants him gone by next week." Robert filed that information away. So this wasn't just random hatred, someone wanted his land. The pieces started falling into place. From his belt, Robert took a small device and pressed a button. Suddenly, sound erupted from the far side of the property, a recording of barking dogs that he'd hidden in the trees. The men spun toward the noise, their shotguns raised. Robert used that moment to close the distance. His hand clamped over the first man's mouth, while his other arm wrapped around the man's throat in a practiced hold. Not enough pressure to cause lasting harm, just enough to cut off blood flow to the brain. Within seconds, the man went limp. Robert lowered him silently to the ground, zip-tied his hands, and moved to the next target. The second man never even turned around. One moment he was peering into the darkness toward the sound of dogs, the next he felt a tap on his shoulder. When he turned, Robert's fist connected with a precise spot on his jaw. A knockout blow learned in hand-to-hand combat training. The man dropped like a stone. "Sleep tight," Robert whispered, securing this man's hands as well. Near the house, 3 men were growing desperate. They'd tried every door and window with no success. One of them threw a rock, shattering a window, but the security bars behind it prevented entry. Their frustration was turning to anger. "Burn it down," one of them growled, pulling out a lighter and a rag. "Let's smoke him out." Before he could act, the motion sensors Robert had placed triggered his next defense. Powerful fans hidden in the bushes roared to life, scattering a cloud of fine powder into the air around them. It was just baking flour, harmless but disorienting as it filled the air and coated their clothes, skin, and eyes. They'd fired blindly into the cloud, bullets thudding harmlessly into the reinforced walls of the house. Robert had anticipated this too. He'd removed anything valuable from the main floor and had reinforced the interior walls with steel plating salvaged from old farm equipment. While they were distracted, Robert circled behind them. The first man never saw him coming. Robert's hand covered his mouth as he dragged him backward into the darkness. A quick press on a nerve bundle at the base of the neck, and the man was unconscious. The other 2 men spun around when their friend disappeared, firing into the darkness. But Robert was already gone, moving like a ghost through the shadows he knew by heart. "He's out here," one of them screamed, panic rising in his voice. "He's hunting us." That was exactly what Robert wanted them to think. Fear was his ally now. The 2 remaining men backed toward the barn, seeking shelter. As they pushed through the door, Robert triggered the mechanism he'd built the day before. The barn door swung shut behind them with a heavy thud, and the bar dropped automatically into place, locking them inside. Through a small opening in the hayloft, Robert watched as they realized they were trapped. They'd pounded on the doors, then tried shooting at the lock, but Robert had reinforced it with steel. "You can waste your bullets," he called down, his voice echoing in the barn. "Or you can sit quietly until this is over." They fired at the sound of his voice, but he was already moving to a different position. The barn was his domain, every beam and shadow familiar territory. Outside, the leader of the group was the only one still free. He stood by the trucks, walkie-talkie in hand, getting increasingly desperate as none of his men responded. Robert watched him through night vision goggles, noting how the man's hand trembled as he reached for his shotgun. "Where are you all?" he shouted into the radio. "Someone answer me." The only response was silence, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the metal roofs of the farm buildings. For the first time in his life, the feed store owner was afraid. And Robert knew that fear could make a man dangerous in unpredictable ways. The hardest part of the night was still to come. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the metal roofs and turning the farm into a sea of mud. Through his night vision goggles, Robert watched the feed store owner pacing by the trucks. The man's body language told the story, shoulders hunched, head swiveling nervously, shotgun clutched so tightly his knuckles must have been white. This was a man unraveling. Robert had dealt with this type before. When cornered, they became unpredictable, dangerous. The feed store owner had come expecting an easy target, not to have his entire crew picked off one by an unseen defender. A crack of lightning split the sky, briefly turning night to day. In that flash, the feed store owner spotted one of his men lying zip-tied near the chicken coop. His reaction was immediate and violent. "I know you're out there," he screamed into the darkness, raising his shotgun. "Come out now, or I start shooting up your house." To prove his point, he fired once, the blast echoing across the property. Glass shattered as the shot took out one of the front windows. Robert felt something shift inside him. Until now, he'd been careful, measured, non-lethal in his approach. But that shot could have hit him if he'd been inside. The line between self-defense and protecting property had just been crossed. From the tree line, Robert pressed a button on his remote. The barn doors unlocked with a heavy clunk. The 2 men trapped inside came bursting out, running toward their boss by the trucks. Perfect, all the remaining threats in one place. The feed store owner grabbed one of them by the shirt. "Where are the others?" "He got them, man. He's like a ghost or something. We've got to go." Not until we burn this place to the ground, the owner snarled, pulling a gas can from the truck bed. Nobody makes a fool out of me. Robert had seen enough. It was time to end this. He moved from the trees toward the open area by the trucks, purposely stepping on a branch to make it snap. All three men spun toward the sound, shotguns raised. Military police. Drop your weapons, Robert called out, using the commanding voice that had once directed elite soldiers in battle. It was an old trick. People instinctively respond to authority in moments of stress. For a second, the younger men hesitated, their shotguns dipping slightly. But the feed store owner wasn't fooled. "There ain't no MPs out here," he shouted, swinging his shotgun toward Robert's voice. "It's just that farmer." Robert was already moving as the shotgun blast tore through the space where he'd been standing. He circled quickly, using the darkness and rain as cover. 20 yards. 15. 10. Close enough now. Last chance, Robert called from a different position. "Put down your weapons." The feed store owner fired again, wild and panicked. The other two men were backing toward the trucks now, their nerve failing. Robert used that moment to make his move. He charged from the shadows, a blur of focused motion. Before the feed store owner could turn, Robert struck the man's arm with a precise blow. A technique taught to disable without killing. The sound of bone snapping was followed by a howl of pain as the shotgun tumbled from useless fingers. Robert caught the weapon before it hit the ground. In one fluid motion, he ejected the shells and tossed the empty shotgun aside. The feed store owner crumpled to his knees, clutching his broken arm. The other two men stayed in shock, then raised their hands slowly. "Wise choice," Robert said quietly. Rain streamed down his face as he stood over the men who had come to destroy everything he built. 5 years of peaceful farming hadn't dulled his skills. If anything, the quiet life had made his mind sharper, his movements more economical. "Who sent you?" Robert asked, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his body. The feed store owner glared up through the rain, hatred in his eyes. "Nobody sent us. We don't want your kind around here." "Try again," Robert said, crouching down to eye level. "You mentioned a boss earlier. Someone wants my land." "Who?" Fear flickered across the man's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. He pressed play, and the man's own voice filled the night. "Boss wants him gone by next week." The younger men exchanged nervous glances. "Tell him, Tom," one of them finally said. "It's over." The feed store owner, Tom, slumped in defeat. "Harrison," he muttered. "County Commissioner Harrison. He's buying up all the land for that new highway bypass. Needs your farm to complete the route." Robert nodded slowly. The pieces fit together now. The targeted attacks on minority farmers, the sheriff's lack of action, the county's sudden interest in his property taxes. "You picked the wrong farm," Robert told them quietly as he secured their hands with zip ties from his pocket. "And definitely the wrong farmer." In the distance, sirens wailed, growing closer. Despite his distrust of local law enforcement, Robert had activated a silent alarm connected to the state police when the first shot was fired at his house. This was bigger than just his farm now. This needed to come to light. As blue and red lights began flashing at the end of his driveway, Robert stood guard over the men who had thought him an easy target. The rain had washed away the last traces of the quiet farmer he pretended to be for 5 years. What remained was the core of steel beneath, a protector who would not be moved. As dawn broke over the hills, Robert's farm looked like a battlefield in the aftermath. State police cars lined his driveway, their lights still flashing against the pale morning sky. Officers moved carefully around the property, collecting evidence, taking photographs, and interviewing the 7 men now sitting handcuffed in separate patrol cars. Robert sat on his porch steps, a blanket around his shoulders and a cup of coffee warming his hands. Chief lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to watch the activity with weary eyes. The old dog hadn't left Robert's side since the officers arrived. Mr. Jackson, a tall state trooper, approached, notebook in hand. "I'm Captain Reynolds. I need to go through your statement once more." For the next hour, Robert walked the captain through the events of the night, showing him the defenses he had created, the surveillance footage he had captured, and playing back the recorded confession about Commissioner Harrison. "You handled yourself remarkably well," Captain Reynolds said finally, choosing his words carefully. Most people would have either run or gotten themselves killed. Robert just nodded, not offering any explanation about his background. But word had already spread. One of the younger officers had recognized Robert's name from a military database check. "Sir," the young officer had whispered to his captain earlier, "he's former Delta Force. 20 years, 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star for an operation in Somalia that's still mostly classified." By noon, reporters had gathered at the edge of Robert's property, held back by police tape. The story was too good to ignore. A group of men attacking a minority farmer, only to discover he was a highly decorated Special Forces veteran. The local news vans arrived first, followed by crews from the larger cities. Robert refused all requests for interviews, turning down offers that grew increasingly generous as the day wore on. His face might have been all over the news, but his voice would not be. The most significant developments came 3 days later. Based on evidence gathered at Robert's farm and subsequent investigations, Commissioner Harrison was arrested at his office. The raid uncovered documents revealing a scheme to force minority farmers off their land through intimidation, buying the properties at rock-bottom prices, and then selling them to the state at massive profits for the planned highway project. The sheriff, found to be Harrison's cousin, was suspended pending investigation for deliberate negligence. 4 more arrests followed, including the deputy who had ignored Robert's earlier calls about suspicious activities. A week after the attack, Robert was repairing his shattered windows when a convoy of trucks pulled into his driveway. He tensed until he recognized Mr. Chen stepping out of the lead vehicle, followed by other farmers from the surrounding counties, all families who had been targeted or threatened over the past year. They came bearing lumber, tools, paint, and food. Without waiting for permission, they set to work, repairing the damage to Robert's house and barn. Children ran playing through the fields while the adults worked. By sunset, the farm looked better than it had before the attack. As they gathered for a meal at folding tables set up in the yard, Mr. Chen raised a glass. "To the man who stood his ground," he said simply, "who fought not just for himself, but for all of us." Robert, uncomfortable with the attention, nodded his thanks. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were people who understood what it meant to build something worth protecting, to claim a place in the world when others tried to push you out. In the months that followed, Robert's quiet life changed in ways he hadn't expected. The farm became a gathering place for community meetings where people of all backgrounds came together to discuss common concerns. The state police captain asked Robert to help train officers in non-lethal defense tactics. The local school invited him to talk to students, not about violence, but about standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Most meaningful to Robert was the Community Watch program that grew from that first gathering. Farmers began checking on each other, sharing security systems, and keeping an eye out for suspicious activities. The attacks stopped completely. 1 year after the raid, Robert stood in his fields watching the sunset. The land that had once been his quiet retreat from the world had become something more. A symbol of resistance, of community, of refusing to be driven away by hatred or greed. Chief padded up beside him, grayer now but still alert. Robert scratched behind the dog's ears. "We did good, old friend," he said quietly. "We did good." In the distance, he could see the Chen family's farm, the rebuilt shed now painted bright red. Beyond that, other farms dotted the rolling hills, places where people were living their lives in peace because one man had remembered how to fight for what mattered. Robert had gone to war many times for his country, but defending this small piece of Tennessee soil and the right of every person to call a place home might have been the most important battle he'd ever won.